I'm Paolo Surico and I'm Professor of Economics at London Business School. Together with my colleague Andrea Galeotti, we have put together a series of mini lectures as a user guide to COVID-19. Today I'm going to present part 1 about gathering the fact. Let me describe what we're going to do and what you're going to learn from this lecture. We're going to present some basic evidence of the pandemic, and we're going to identify some pattern in the data from existing research available out there that might have been overlooked. We're going to discuss what drives the capacity of a country health system. After this lecture, we'll be able to understand the demographic composition of carrier and critical patients. You will be able to use cross-country comparison to be able to evaluate pros and cons of the different health policy strategies that has been adopted by different countries around the world. Also, you will be able to measure and to identify a country of system capacity and which kind of policy can expand it. Let me start by briefly summarizing the evidence that by now is sadly known. On this chart, you find as a vertical axis the number of infected cases as a function of the number of days that have passed since case number 100 was declared. All country has been normalized to 0 so that you can make a comparison across country. There is something that is very clear from this curve. The number of cases tend to exponentially increase, and to all countries, sooner or later, they tend to catch up with China. There are, however, some notable exceptions. South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Why those countries are different? Why, after the same number of days, they tend to have developed much less infected cases than the other country? Can we learn anything from their health policy strategy? For example, South Korea have used a huge testing program. Japan, there are strong social norms and a very large obedience of the people to the government indication. In Singapore and Hong Kong, suppression policy, in particular isolation and quarantine, has been extensively practiced. Another way of looking at the evidence is, rather than looking at the empirical contagion curve, to look at the empirical mortality curve. On the vertical axis of this chart, you can see the number of deaths as a function of the number of days since death number 10 was declared. Again, we can see a clear curve with countries catching up, and in the case of Italy, actually overtaking China. Again, South Korea is an outlier. After the same number of days since death number 10 was declared, South Korea has a fraction of the number of deaths of Italy. Why? What can we learn from the experience of the other country? Let me start by looking at the infected. In this chart, you see for each age group of the population, what is the share of infected in that age group. South Korea is the red bar, whereas Italy is represented by the green bar. A stark difference emerged from this comparison. If you look at the Korean data, it will look like that most of the infected are young. In fact, in the people in their 20s, you have as much as 30% of the infected, but people in their 70 and the 80 are only 6 or 3%. On the other hand, Italy has very few people that are infected among the young, and among the old, the share gets as large as 20% among people in their 60s, in their 70s, and in their 80s. Why? Which data shall we trust? To gather some information about this, it's very useful to look at the different health policy strategy adopted by the two countries. South Korea has essentially tested everyone. Not literally, but using a statistical procedure which is called testing at random, using a representative sample of the population, which has been tested, and therefore we can be sure that they are sampled evenly for different age groups. Italy, on the other hand, has chosen a policy in which they only tested the symptomatic, and typically the worse and critical one that were going to hospital. So the sample of Italy is usually biased toward the people that actually develop symptoms. But looking at South Korea, it suggests that in fact there are much more asymptomatic than symptomatic, which suggests that the number of infected cases is probably much larger than we know. Of course, you might think that South Korea is special, is something that scientists called external validity. However, there's something that we can learn from other countries, then something that we can learn from other experience. This is what scientists call a quasi-natural experiment, which happened in the city of Vo in Veneto. In that city, a large share of the population contracted the virus. True, Italy had a policy that only infected people should be tested, but it happened that in the city of Vo, most of the population get infected. So the city of Vo is a representative sample of the population in the city of Vo, simply because the majority of people got infected. And within the sample of the city of Vo, it's very clear that the majority of infected are among the young. So now we can be more confident and state that COVID-19 infects the young much more than it does with the old. It's just that the young are much more likely to be asymptomatic. It's true, however, that COVID-19 makes much more death among the old. What you see in this chart by age group is the so-called fatality rate, which is the ratio between the number of deaths and the number of cases. Bear in mind that there is large uncertainty about this ratio. We can only be sure about the number of deaths. But the number of cases is unknown because in most parts of the world, with the exception of South Korea, only symptomatic cases get tested. This implies that the number of cases in everywhere else but South Korea is much larger than actually what recorded by the government. In fact, South Korea has a fatality rate which is below 1%. China is 3%, Italy is a surprising and not very credible 7%, which is probably an artifact of the fact that in Italy, only symptomatic has been tested so far. The number is probably much closer, the actual number is more likely to be closer to South Korea on China, suggesting that in Italy, unfortunately, there are many more infected cases than the Italian government believes. Something, however, that is quite consistent across country is that the share of people that die tends to be in the older group. So it must be true that COVID-19 tends to kill more the old. Still, there seems to be a dramatic differences between the share of the old among the Italian relative to the Chinese and the people from South Korea. To appreciate whether this difference is true or is a statistical artifact, we can look at another piece of evidence, the demographic pyramid. This measure the share of population in each age group among the male and among the female. For example, if you are a Chinese male and you have between 30 and 34 years old, you will be representing 4.6% of the total Chinese population. And if you are a female in the same age group, you will be represented 4.3% of the Chinese population. What is clear by comparing the pyramid of China with the one of Italy is that China has a much fatter part down here. This implies that there are many more young as a share of the population than there are in Italy. In fact, for virtually each of these groups, once you put together the male or the female, you arrive to 2% more of the share of population in the same age group in China than it is in Italy. Of course, if the bottom part is larger, it has to be the case that the top part is thinner. If you compare, for example, people in their 70s and you sum female and male, what you get is that you have a share of the population that is more than 2% larger than the same share of population for China. In other words, Italy has a larger, far larger share of the population among the old than China has. But we have said in the previous slide that COVID-19 kills more older people than younger. But if Italy has a larger share of the population among the old, this must imply that the fatality rate must be higher for Italy than for China, and that's exactly what we observe. Why do we give so much importance to number of cases? This is the contagion curve that everybody talks about and that by now you will be probably familiar with. The red curve represents the number of cases, of infected cases, as a function of the time since the first case is developed. Without any policy intervention, what's happening is that the curve is flat. But then, as if the first people infect, these tend to infect another person. But now there are 2 people that can infect other 2 people. And now those 4 people can go and infect other 4 people. And these multiply in a way that make the curve growing exponentially. But while the curve grows exponentially, it arrives at a point in which many people have got infected. And if they well recover, they also get immunity. This means that the new infected cannot affect everybody else because people have already got immunity, and therefore we go down the contagion curve. The problem is that the healthcare system has a capacity, which is represented here as the horizontal gray line. Whenever we are above the health system capacity, it means that there are more critical patients than intensive care unit beds available. This is a large fraction of those people might die as a result of a lack of the intensive care unit. Being an economist, we are used to think about it as a supply and demand. You can think of the red contagion curve as the demand for healthcare. And you can think about the horizontal line, the gray line, as the supply for healthcare. What is the problem with the red curve? That the cases of infected are so concentrated in a short period of time that these exceed by far the capacity of the health system. So what the government is trying to do is try to slow down the spread of the disease in a way that the number of cases can be spread out. The area under the blue curve is not necessarily smaller and is not even possibly desirable that is smaller than the red curve. However, the cases are spread over time in a way that the healthcare system can cope and demand and supply can meet. Whereas without any intervention, there is an excess demand that the government needs to find a way to resolve. The big question is how to achieve this more effectively. There is a consensus about the desirability of flattening the curve. There is less consensus of how to achieve that. A first step toward understanding what the government could do is to look at how much it can expand the intensive care capacity. In the next video, part 2, Epidemiology for Dummies, we are going to talk about how to slow down the speed of contagion. Let's start from the expansion of capacity. First of all, let's appreciate how we can identify and measure what is a health system capacity in each country. In this chart, you see for many OECD countries what is the number of critical beds for every 100,000 people. Germany has 29 beds for every 100,000 citizens. Portugal has only 4. Italy is about the average with a number close to 12.5. When we talk about health system capacity, we don't talk just as number of beds, but also of number of equipment, which for COVID-19 is mostly about ventilators, being a disease that brings respiratory complications. So it should not come as a surprise that in an effort to expand capacity of ventilators, Italy has asked its only manufacturer to quadruple the supply of ventilators. Germany has ordered 10,000 more, and Matt Hancock, UK Health Secretary, has stated, if you produce a ventilator, we will buy. No number is too high. There is also geographical heterogeneity in the health system capacity. In this chart, we report the share of intensive care unit used for COVID-19 patients. Just to give you an understanding of how intensive care units work, typically, or at each point in time during the year, 70% of those beds are occupied with people with other disease. Car accident, stroke, critical care due to the normal and seasonal influenza. Is only 30% of beds, on average, which are actually free, which are actually spare to be used for other emergencies. This is what you see in this chart as the horizontal green line. As you can see, in terms just as COVID-19 patient is concerned, Lombardy is already well above its capacity. People must be sitting in rooms, in corridors, or simply must have been turned away from the hospital. And the situation doesn't look any better in Marche, Piemonte, Val d'Aosta, Liguria. It's only in the south which still seems to have spare capacity. Overall, as a country, Italy seems to be already pretty much stretched. There is, however, some good news. In the short run, healthcare supply can be expanded. This is the case of Lombardy between the 25th of February and the 16th of March. The number of coronavirus cases increased, but with it, the share of patients that were reserved for coronavirus increased. And in particular, the region of Lombardy was able to expand, going from a number as low as 700 on the at the beginning of the sample, and in a matter of a few days managed to arrive. So from the 5th of March to the 16th of March, in 10 days, managed to move from 700 places to 1,200 places, an increase of 500 intensive care units. So what the government can start to use beds which are in the private sector, in the private health sector, and pay the private health sector to expand this capacity. Can start using hotels, can start using barracks, can start using even school and classroom as intensive care unit. But you don't need only beds, you also need ventilators. So you need to turn to your manufacturing industry and ask them to produce more ventilators, and to any manufacturing firm to turn and convert themselves into producing components that together can be assembled to new KSI ventilator. However, it's not just a matter of physical capital. Expanding capacity also means expanding human capital capacity. There will not be enough nurses, there will be not enough doctors. So one option that the government has is to recall all nurses and doctors which are retired. It may even go further and starting to train for very basic tasks associated with the ventilator, police officers and school teachers, and ask the army to come in and to carry out the duty of police officer. Not only, but if the cases are regionally concentrated like the case of Lombardy, a good idea is to bring non-disease related critical care, critical patient, in other regions which still have spare capacity to release a little bit the pressure on the region in difficulty. So what we have learned in this part one is that COVID-19 is the worst health crisis of our time. Young are much more likely to be infected. They are the carrier and they are typically asymptomatic. But old are more likely to die. Many countries are facing strong excess demand for healthcare. There are too many critical patients, not just about COVID-19, for too few beds and ventilators in intensive care unit. This poses a challenge and a threat not only to infected patients, but also to regular critical patients for any other reason, which are now much more likely to die or waiting longer time for the critical attention that they need. Expanding healthcare supply requires turning hotel, barracks, and possibly school into intensive care unit, but also asking to the manufacturing industry to turn into maker of ventilators component. Still, it's not enough to expand capacity of physical capital. You also need to expand human capital capacity. Recall retired nurse and personnel, train police officer, volunteer, where the armies carry out police duty. This is as much as means for this part one on gathering the facts. The next part is about epidemiology for dummies. Thank you very much.